My name is Tess Summer, and I'm the program manager for the Health and Housing Consortium. There are a lot of you in this meeting today, so if you're new here, the consortium is a collaborative network of healthcare, housing, homeless, and social service organizations, as well as government partners with the shared goal of improving health equity and housing stability. We work together by fostering cross-sector relationships, informing policy, building the capacity of frontline workers, and bridging the gaps between the health and housing sectors. As part of this, we often host trainings for frontline staff across the various sectors about the state of housing, health services, legal options for clients, and more. So a few housekeeping items. Everyone should already be set on mute, so we do ask you to refrain from unmuting during the presentation. We have live transcriptions available. To enable or disable them, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions throughout the training, please enter them in the chat box and we will get to them during the Q&A portion of the event. And we also welcome you to enter any resources as you think of them. I do want to note, we do have a large group here today and we only have 90 minutes for this training. So there might be some questions that we can't get to, but I want to let you know that we have a FHEPS training in August, and then we will be offering a session that we're calling Ask a Lawyer, where you'll be able to come in and ask questions pertaining to CityFHEPS or FHEPS that maybe we weren't able to get to today, or that are maybe more specific to your own clients, unless broadly applicable to a wider audience. So be on the lookout for that registration link. I will be sending the training slides and the session recording after this training, so be on the lookout for that as well. And during our training today, our Legal Aid Society trainers will be sharing information regarding the CityFHEPS program. And I just want to give a huge shout out to these trainers for all the information they're sharing with us today. This is a really important topic, and we are so grateful to the Legal Aid team. And so with that, I will hand it over to Zach.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's a big group, and we're really excited to have you here. So Susan and ICE2 and I will be leading the training. Please, again, put some of your questions into the chat. Some will be brought out in a larger question and answer period, but please do put those in the chat as we go through. As you know, today's topic in the series is CityFHEPS. So we're going to be looking specifically at CityFHEPS. We will discuss some comparisons to FHEPS as well, but the focus of today's training is CityFHEPS. So just to start out, I just want to give you a list of the legal aid attorneys and caseworkers who are working on the FHEPS team that you can follow up with in your borough if you have any questions about CityFHEPS. For the Bronx team, we have Vanessa, ICE2, Leslie, myself, Amber, and Dean, and all of the emails are to the right. And again, this PowerPoint presentation will be sent out after this training, so no need to write down these contacts now, but just so that you're aware of the team. In Brooklyn, we have Rebecca, Susan, Aviv, Emily, Ann, and Ishrat. And in Manhattan, we have Charles and Tracy. In Queens, there's a turnover right now, but those contacts will be updated. And in Staten Island, we have Andrew and Abele. So I will hand it over to Susan, and we'll go back and forth conveying information about CityFHEPS as we go along. So over to Susan, who is the legal aid guru of CityFHEPS and all things FHEPS. Susan, you're on mute.
Okay. I work in the Brooklyn office, and the best way to, if you have questions after today, is to email our team. Everybody is a housing lawyer and I'm a benefits lawyer. So everybody's often in court or with clients. So the best way to reach us is email. So we're going to talk about CityFHEPS, which originally started as CityFHEPS without an H. Now it has an H in it, and it stands for City Fighting Homelessness and Eviction Prevention Supplement. So now it has an H. Sometimes you hear people from HRA saying CityFHEPS, and they said that to differentiate the two programs, but we want everybody to keep that H silent and say CityFHEPS, because we want landlords to be comfortable with the FHEPS program, which has been around for since 2003, and before that through the Jiggets lawsuit. And landlords like that program, and we want them to be comfortable with CityFHEPS, so the H is silent. So in order, and there are two parts of CityFHEPS. CityFHEPS in the community, which is what we're going to talk about today, as well as CityFHEPS to leave shelter. We're not going to talk about that because we're all working in the community. So, so we'll be talking about how to get CityFHEPS in the community. Different rules apply to get out of shelter with CityFHEPS. So the basic rule is the income of the household or family must be at or below 200% of the federal poverty line the first year when somebody's qualifying. And a new rule came into effect in December of last year that on the second or subsequent years of the program, people's income can go up to 80% of area median income. So that's a lot more than it used to be, so that people can transition to work and be self-supporting. So it's that's a way better program, because it used to be people would fall off the program. And I'm just going to mention there's no more link programs except for link 6. And that covers if somebody's showing up at the homeless system and another family is willing to take in roommates. The Link 6 program would pay for the roommates or their families to live with another tenant of record. And depending on how many people are doubling up with a tenant of record, they'll pay between $650 and $1,000. Mainly, we see that program when people are showing up at the homeless shelter system, and there's somebody who's willing to take them in as a under tenant. Next slide.
So there was a couple really key changes that happened in 2021 in response to a lot of advocacy to increase CityFHEPS levels. And we will talk more in detail about these as the presentation goes on. We just wanted to highlight these at the beginning so that you're aware of them. Okay. So in September, the CityFHEPS A levels increased to about around 108% of fair market value of what NYCHA Section 8 was paying for that year. So in other words, it was pegged to what Section 8 was allowing for apartments rather than the lower rent caps that we had seen previously with CityFHEPS. Coupled with that, maybe we're less excited about this, but as an offset to that, there were some changes to the program that included some bedroom requirements, meaning the number of people in the household and the number of bedrooms that could be allowed for that household, some utility deductions, and a rent reasonableness test, which really isn't in effect yet. We'll talk more about that later, but it could be reimposed. There's also some new CityFHEPS B program will subsidize certain apartments and will include some social services, and that began as of December 2021. And also a second year, the program tenant again can be at 80% of AMI. Next slide.
So there were additional increases this May. And what had happened was the federal government didn't increase the Section 8 levels enough in New York City, and the city appealed and they won the appeal. So the federal government increased the Section 8 levels, and therefore the CityFHEPS and the FHEPS levels. So the CityFHEPS levels went into effect in May of this year. The FHEPS levels, we hope, will be in effect by August, but we don't have a date certain yet. These increases that went into effect for CityFHEPS in May are approximately a 14% increase, which is really important because the housing market in New York City is even more expensive today and in July than it was back in January. And so these increases are about $200 for each bedroom size. So we'll talk about that, how the bedrooms work in as the presentation goes along. Next.
So just as kind of an understanding in context of the kind of governmental organization that we're talking about. So the New York City Department of Social Services, or DSS, when we talk about DSS, we're talking about a combination of HRA and DHS. So every county in New York State has a DSS, and that's supervised by the state agency, the New York State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, or what we'd like to kindly refer to and affectionately as OTDA. New York City has one DSS for the city DSS, and it covers all 5 boroughs and counties. So just as kind of an understanding of how that works, in 2016, the Department of Homeless Services, DHS, combined with HRA to form the New York City Department of Social Services. Okay, next slide.
So we're going to talk about CityFHEPS in the community, which is a much smaller program than CityFHEPS in shelter. So another change that came into effect in December was there is a CityFHEPS A program and a CityFHEPS B program. The CityFHEPS B program is eventually going to work for not-for-profits to run buildings and lease them out to CityFHEPS holders. And so that hasn't been established yet. Money was just approved in December and the whole program. And so it has to be developed. It will take time, but we hope the mayor puts an emphasis on rolling this out because, as we know, more and more people are homeless than ever. Now, and on the CityFHEPS A side, so there's CityFHEPS A for moving out of shelter, that's the larger program, and CityFHEPS to pay and stay in the community if there's a court case. And then there's some other rules for who would qualify for that program, so we'll be talking about that. If somebody can't stay in their apartment or they need to move, CityFHEPS can do, after they qualify for the program a year or two later, they could also move with CityFHEPS A. Next.
So some of you might be more familiar with the FHEPS program and work more closely with that than you have with CityFHEPS. And again, we're concentrating on CityFHEPS on this training, and we don't want to confuse the two, but there are some important comparisons to think through when you're thinking for your client whether you want to pursue a FHEPS application or a CityFHEPS application. So it is sort of key to think through these at the beginning. So just as an overview for FHEPS, again, not CityFHEPS, but for state FHEPS, there must be at least one person in the household who's in receipt of cash assistance. So an open public assistance case, not just SNAP, they have to be receiving cash assistance. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're receiving cash on their EBT card. If they're receiving shelter, that would also qualify, but they have to have an open cash assistance case. That's really key. And it's not the same for CityFHEPS, so that's also key to understand. The subsidy is for FHEPS is tied to that receipt of cash assistance. And what that means and why it's important is that a family that loses their cash assistance because they go over income, for example, loses the FHEPS supplement as well. The FHEPS supplement cannot survive the closure of the cash assistance case. Other household members who are not a part of the cash assistance, or who have cash, who have other sources of income, they pay 30% of their gross income and they do not get the subsidy. There also must be a minor child living in the household. So this is, that's your first question: is there a minor in the household? And when there's not, even when the minor leaves the household, the FHEPS family is no longer eligible for the FHEPS supplement. So there used to be a court requirement that you were in court. That is no longer the case. You can satisfy that with other documentation showing that there's rent owed. But now let's just do a comparison to how CityFHEPS works. So for CityFHEPS, the household must have an income at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. And again, that second year and beyond, 80% of AMI.
We're not doing.
Members of the household pay 30% of their gross income, or a shelter allowance. There's a shelter allowance that goes through if they are receiving cash assistance, but it's 30% of income otherwise. And this is key: the subsidy is not tied to cash assistance. So in other words, if you're dealing with someone who qualifies for the triggering factors, which we'll talk about in more detail, it doesn't matter that they have a cash assistance case. So in other words, if they're receiving Social Security and so therefore don't qualify for a cash assistance case, they can still get CityFHEPS if they meet one of the other triggering criteria. So the subsidy is not tied to cash assistance, but there is an arrears component, and that can be paid for those who are staying. The household can also be a single couple, adult family, or a family with a minor. So having a minor doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get CityFHEPS. If you're qualified for FHEPS, and with the minor situation in the household, you are expected to apply for FHEPS before applying for CityFHEPS. However, the point is that for CityFHEPS, it can be any type of a household. You don't have to have a minor in the household. It can even be a single adult, and you can still qualify. All right, next slide, please.
Matt, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
It's Tess.
Yes.
What does 200% of the FPL mean? We got a question.
That's funny because the next slide explains that perfectly. So that was a great question, Tess, to segue us in to talking about the federal poverty levels.
So the federal poverty levels are set every year by the federal government in January. The city adopts them generally in June. For some programs in February. But so if somebody is making, and let's look at a family of three who earns $23,030 a year is at 100% of the federal poverty line. That's making grossing $1,919 a month. If we double that, that would be $3,838. So that would be with the minimum wage at $15 an hour, this covers people working at minimum wage. But people who work at small families who work at minimum wage get kicked off cash assistance before they're working 35 hours a week. And so some ways CityFHEPS is better than FHEPS because it allows low-income working people or people on fixed incomes such as Social Security to qualify for FHEPS and therefore rent subsidy. Next.
Now compare this to the 80% of AMI for years 2 and on. And when you think about this in terms of the way that HRA and the state run these programs, it is quite consistent, even with how someone qualifies for public assistance, right? It's much in terms of the income that you have, the threshold for having a public open cash assistance case, right? The income amount is lower than once you're on it. Later on, if you increase your income, you don't necessarily lose the cash assistance case. And that's, of course, because there's an incentivization both not to go on the program to begin with if you can work otherwise. And then once you're on program, they don't want to disincentivize finding work. So here you can see too with the AMI, it's a similar type of a construct. when we look at that family of three, where the 200% FP per month was 3,660, we see in the following years that 80% per month is actually 8,007. So it's a much higher threshold to be able to remain on the case. So if there is extra income later, that's not going to make you roll off. You would have to have an incredibly large increase in income to lose the CityFHEPS supplement.
And the subsidy gradually goes away. The more you earn, the smaller your subsidy is.
Sorry, I have a quick question. Hi, this is Elizabeth from VIP. So does that mean the second year, if someone finds, just to clarify, if someone finds a job, that then their cash assistance will they still have an open cash assistance case, or will it just be an open public assistance case? Will they no longer be receiving cash assistance? How does that work in terms of keeping
again,
their
this
subsidy?
is what we're talking about isn't cash assistance, right? Because for CityFHEPS, you're not required to have an open cash assistance case.
Oh,
So,
got it. Okay.
Right. I mean, there are different rules for when you lose your cash assistance case, and those thresholds are much lower. It's the same kind of a differentiated approach, where to get onto cash assistance is more difficult than to stay on it. But it's not these same numbers. So don't confuse this with a public assistance case.
Got it. Thank you.
And the way the CityFHEPS is delivered, it's delivered through a different computer system. So it's been approved by the City Department of Finance, and the CityFHEPS subsidy is issued, let's say for the month of February, it would be issued the end of January. So it's delivered before February 1st, and it comes as a lump sum of money for the entire month. So if somebody's share is, if the subsidy is $2,000 a month, it's delivered the end of January for February. And then the client, if they're on welfare, their cash assistance, their shelter allowance of $400 would be issued $200 and $200. If the family was working family, they would pay 30% of their gross the beginning of the month, and the subsidy gets sent separately.
And that's probably illustrated on the next slide.
So this is just a comparison of 80% of the area media income and 30% share of their income is what they would have to pay towards the rent. And so as people's income goes up, their share goes up greatly. Here, a family of three would, if they're at 80% of area media income, they're making almost $100,000 a year, and their monthly share of the rent is $8,000. 30% of their share would be $2,402. And so that's a lot of money that they'll start paying towards the rent. And at that point, the government says, okay, now you're making enough money to afford your own rent, you're on your own.
So we mentioned this earlier, but again, the CityFHEPS amounts increased in September of 2021. And for those of you who want to know the regulation through which that happened, it was Title 24 in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations. So that went into effect on September 1st. Since then, HRA raised the rent levels so that it matches the Section 8 levels. Along with that, there are new requirements about bedrooms, meaning the number of bedrooms that are appropriate for a household size, and then some utility deductions and rent reasonableness. And there were some other rules that went into effect on December 1st as well. So in terms of the utility deductions, it creates, instead of before with CityFHEPS, there was just one amount based off of the household size. Now there's a spectrum of amounts that are authorized based off of which utilities are included in the apartment. So in other words, is electricity part of your lease, or is that something you're paying separately? And then the amounts are increase or decrease to reflect those inclusions or exclusions. So this is this could increase subsidies between $500 and $800 per month if all utilities were, for example, if all utilities were included in the rent and the rent was reasonable. Next slide.
So this is a chart of what people, a family with a minor child gets for shelter allowance. So a family of 3 only gets $400 a month. And it used to be CityFHEPS had the maximum rent for a family of 3 of $1,580. And then the subsidy would be $1,580 minus the 400 equals the subsidy $1,180. Those numbers went up September 1st of 2021. So the next slide will show us what they were.
Right. So before, for a family of 3, where even if the enhanced maximum rent with the shelter and the subsidy combined was $1,580, when you look here, you have this spectrum of options that range from no utilities being included for a family of 3, in which the family could receive up to $2,529, and then moving backwards across the slide, if all utilities were included, up to even $2,805. So that's a significant increase, going from, if the enhanced maximum rent previously of only $1,580 to now up to $2,805, and at a minimum $2,529. So a very large increase by percentage. Next slide.
So the CityFHEPS levels went up again May 1st for new leases. So if somebody is already on CityFHEPS and their lease is being renewed for May or June or July, they can get the new levels. If somebody is in the middle of a lease, they have to wait till it's their recertification period to get the higher new levels. Next.
Someone with a raised hand. I'm not sure if Daryl Edwards wants to unmute and ask the question. Daryl, we can't hear you, unfortunately. So if you could type your question in the chat, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Just to qualify too, there's one comparing apples and oranges here that I want to point out, because it does look like a bigger increase than it actually is, although it is a substantial increase. But if you notice, before it was the household number was how that computation happened, that $1,580 for a family of 3. Now it's bedrooms. 3 bedrooms are that amount. So it is a slightly different comparison because depending on the composition of the household, you're likely not using a 3-bedroom house for a household of 3, more likely a 2-bedroom house. Although we'll talk more about that later on. But if you see on this is the new, I mean, even since September, it's increased even more. So when we see a number of bedrooms for 3, we've gone up on those previous slides for all utilities included was 2,800. Now it's at 3,118. And before, it was 2,500 for no utilities included for a 3-bedroom apartment. Now it's 2,912. So it has increased substantially again. Next slide.
So we're going to talk about some other CityFHEPS rules in the community. Next.
We do have another raised hand. Roger
Sure.
Patterson, if you're able to unmute, please ask your question.
Yes, I got a quick question. Perhaps my math is wrong, but for single adults who's coming into shelter or who come in shelter unemployed, but we get them jobs and they make a minimum wage, they're not even, are they qualified for the CityFHEPS? Because I'm informed that at minimum wage disqualified them. They're not even eligible. So what are they eligible for?
Okay, well, can we go back to the chart for May?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the way the new program runs in September is you're eligible for an individual could rent a bedroom for $800 a month, or they could rent in a single room occupancy for, if all utilities are included, $1,634 a month, or they could rent a studio or a 1-bedroom. So there's a lot of options for a single person, but they have to qualify to leave shelter if they're a single person. And we're only going to talk about in the community, but there are about 5 ways to leave shelter. Like veterans automatically acquire, US vets automatically are eligible for CityFHEPS after spending 90 days in shelter. People over 60 who are spend 90 days in the shelter are automatically eligible to leave shelter. People who have Social Security or SSI, a single adult, after 90 days in shelter would be eligible. So there's a whole bunch of different factors for people to leave the shelter. Today we're only gonna talk about in the community, and maybe we could, in the future, maybe in September, do a training for leaving shelter. But today we're gonna mostly talk about the how to qualify in the community, because there's 2 different sets of rules. And not everybody's gonna qualify. If you have no immigration status, you won't qualify for either program if you're a single person. And if you don't meet the rules to get out of shelter are vets, over 60, getting federal benefits for disability, or working 30 hours. So not everybody's going to be able to fit into those rules to get out of shelter. There are coalitions of advocates working, are just going to start a new lobby session on how to expand, how to get out of shelter, and how to expand the qualifications for CityFHEPS in the community. Because the programs are not big enough to meet all the needs. And so that's a really good question you raised. All right, next slide. So Zach?
Sure. So Susan just mentioned some of these, and I talked about them before when I was saying you don't have to have an open cash assistance case, you don't have to have minors in the household, but there are other triggers that allow you to apply for CityFHEPS. So the household facing eviction or evicted in the last 12 months must, again, include a veteran or live in and can save a rent controlled apartment. That's not a rent stabilized apartment, a rent controlled apartment. It could include a person who has a DHS shelter history, or be currently receiving programs from Adult Protective Services or community guardianship program. And this one we hardly ever see, but also some individuals who are referred through a qualifying program like ACS, DYCD, DOC. So in other words, think about this like CityFHEPS was created, it's a city program, not like the state program. It's created to catch those marginalized and vulnerable individuals who wouldn't be caught within the FHEPS program. So there are qualifications, or these triggering kind of qualifications for you to be eligible for CityFHEPS. So it must be one of these. In housing court, what we most often see is a shelter history, and less often we see veteran status. We sometimes work with Adult Protective Services. We'll talk more about that. It can be problematic involving APS in your client's case. So involving them is something that's a bit of a risk, and also their process is a little bit different in how they evaluate whether someone, whether they want to pursue CityFHEPS. So there are some issues with working through APS, but that is a qualifying program. And again, we really don't see very many of these other referrals that are happening in our context. Next slide.
So these are the documents people must gather for when they're going to home base in the community. You go to home base to apply for CityFHEPS in the community, and you go to the home base that serves your zip code. And the zip codes are on the, you can Google your zip code and just put in home base for zip code 11215, and you can see which home base serves the community. So vets have to get their discharge papers from armed services. And if they've lost them, then they're going to have to work with somebody who knows how to track those down, or sometimes they have to be a lot of those original papers for people in the armed services were burned in a giant fire in, I think it was St. Louis. So sometimes you have to recreate your paperwork and get the VA to give updated discharge papers. For people who are rent controlled, they're gonna have to produce paperwork that the apartment is under rent control status. And so people with rent control generally don't have leases, except maybe the lease when they rented the apartment, or grandma rented the apartment after World War II. And for people who had a previous history in the Department of Homeless Services system, there's a computer program, a system called CARES, and one would have to sign a release to get a advocate who has access to somebody in the government to produce the CARES history. And so somebody who's been in and that history is 30 years back in the computer system. So if somebody was in the computer, in the shelter system, they would qualify for CityFHEPS. Also, there's adult protective services. APS must give a letter to the client saying, we are granting Susan APS services. And those are limited services that APS is going to help that person who doesn't have any family, adults who are able to help them, or any neighbors. So those are very limited people, and they're usually very either have mental health issues or physical disabilities or conditions. And then occasionally we see somebody with a referral from the Department of Corrections or from ACS. Generally, somebody would have to be so sick that they don't have to go into the shelter system first and wait their 90 days to be eligible for the program. Next.
Susan, we had a quick question. Where can the release for the history for CARES computer system be found?
Home base will generally give that to somebody. If somebody has a legal services or legal aid lawyer through a housing court case, we would contact the HRA has that form on their website, but they're not going to release it to anybody, to clients. They would want it generally through an advocate who deals with CityFHEPS program, usually directly at home base or their legal services attorney.
Home base is only servicing individuals who's not in shelter.
Right. And so we're talking about CityFHEPS in the community. So if somebody had a past history of being in shelter, home base would look into the care system to see, hey, has Susan Bond ever been in the shelter system? Never in the shelter system, I'm not going to qualify for CityFHEPS unless I meet one of those other qualifications. Right, and my income, I have to be in a lawsuit, and or I have to have been sued for or gotten a rent demand from my landlord to pay the rent and have income under 200% of poverty. So CityFHEPS is available for people, singles or families or couples in the community who are at danger of being evicted and losing their home. And, but it's only a very limited number, tip of the iceberg, the most vulnerable in the community who are eligible for CityFHEPS to get to stay and pay in their apartment or move to a new apartment. Does that answer your question, Roger? All right, Zach, do you want to talk about APS services?
So I started to talk about this a little bit, but circling back and going into a little bit more detail. Adult protective services, you can bring into a situation, through their site, there's a way to report that an individual might be in need of their services. They would send out a caseworker to evaluate whether that individual in fact does need an open APS case. If they decide that they do, they then take control over the application process for CityFHEPS. So sometimes APS will automatically apply for CityFHEPS for someone who is eligible. Other times we've seen that without some advocacy, APS may just apply for a one-shot deal without us sort of shepherding through and saying that this is something that would benefit the client as CityFHEPS instead. So note that APS will not, so let me start by saying, you should really think about involving APS before you bring them in, because their services, as it says at the bottom of the slide, can be quite intrusive. You should definitely speak to a supervisor before involving them. And if appropriate, you should discuss with your client the pros and cons of this. I realize in an APS case, that's not always possible, but there is certain freedoms, in a sense, can be taken away through the APS process in terms of some financial freedom. There's definitely just involvement of APS that does limit what a client's decision making to some degree. So note that APS will not accept a case. That doesn't just accept every case because you recommend it. First of all, APS will not accept a case if there's a single, if the adult has family or friends, anyone, a single individual adult who can help them, right? APS is really there as a safety net for adults who are vulnerable, who do not have anyone else to assist them, or who are in a dangerous situation and need to be protected. So what kind of services does APS provide when they go in to do a case review? They're really evaluating whether they can be of assistance to the client by providing one of these services. One is whether the client might need a guardian ad litem in court, who is someone who represents them in court in their interest because they're not able to go into court or don't have the capacity to manage their own case. Sometimes APS is working out a situation with a representative payee needed to pay a rent share each month from SSI or SSD, meaning Social Security checks will be sent directly to APS, and APS will disperse those checks to the landlord and the remainder to the individual in cases where the individual is not capable of managing their own finances or where there's concerns that other adults are manipulating the individual. Also, APS might work with a client if they feel that there's a concern of hoarding and a deep clean is needed for health reasons. So there's different programs that APS is evaluating when they're going through that case decision as whether they will take the case or not. But just do be aware that before you involve APS, that it is appropriate for your client. Next slide.
So there's some other rules for community CityFHEPS. So the tenant must have a lease or other agreement or a right to stay for 1 year. So that could be rent control or Mitchell-Lama apartment. So it depends on having a right to stay in the apartment for at least a year. If eligible for CityFHEPS, they must, if they're eligible for FHEPS, if there's a family on cash assistance with a minor child, they generally must take FHEPS first because the state is paying for it, and that saves CityFHEPS for another household. So some families are about to have their cases closed because they're working, then they should be evaluated for CityFHEPS. or if the last child has aged out of being a minor. There's a rule that everybody in the house or who's going to be living in the family must have income if they have immigration status. So generally we start with people applying for cash assistance. If they're disabled, then they would be applying for SSI or Social Security disability, but those programs take like a 2-year application process. So they would have to apply for cash assistance in the meantime. And everybody who's not getting cash assistance, who's getting SSI or Social Security or even unemployment, they have to pay 30% of their gross income towards the rent. Or if they're working. So if there's a 22-year-old in the house is working, they must pay 30% of their gross income. And sometimes it's hard to get young adults to pay towards the rent, but they have to. So the CityFHEPS application process doesn't really start until Homebase has gathered all the documents from the landlord and the tenant. And we have been pushing the city to, once all those documents have been provided to Homebase, that the process of having that application reviewed by the city from that day it's submitted to all the inspections and things that have to be done should take 30 days. Because we don't want to lose apartments and we don't want to have landlords not getting paid while they're waiting for the processing to be done. So there's a big move to get this CityFHEPS process done in 30 days.
So before I go into more details about the lease requirements, I just wanted to bring up something we haven't spoken about before, which is, in that evaluation of FHEPS versus CityFHEPS, there's something also to keep in mind. If a client is eligible because they have minors in the household in an open cash assistance case for both FHEPS and CityFHEPS. So in that example, let's say that family also has a shelter history. As Susan was saying, you'd want to evaluate whether they're about to lose the cash assistance case. But other than it being a requirement that you apply for FHEPS first because it's a state program, it's also 99% of the time in the client's best interest, particularly if there are arrears. And the reason for that is that when you apply for arrears from the FHEPS program, those arrears are non-recoupable, meaning if the client owes money in court and if they are FHEPS eligible, the arrears will be paid and the client does not have to worry about ever paying those back. For CityFHEPS, it works differently. The arrears are recoupable, meaning that once the arrears are paid, it's the expectation that the client will pay back those arrears over time, or if the client isn't paying them back directly, that they're deducted from the benefit they're receiving going forward. So it's typically in the client's best interest to apply for FHEPS first because those arrears are non-recoupable. The other thing is that when someone, because of the way that the qualifying triggers work for CityFHEPS, someone who qualifies for CityFHEPS now is going to qualify for CityFHEPS in 5 years if the FHEPS runs out because a minor leaves the household or because their income closes the CA case, because those are really sort of immutable factors, right? You are a veteran or you have a shelter history. Those aren't going away. Those will still be qualities that will qualify you for CityFHEPS if you lose FHEPS later on. All right, so digging a little bit more into the lease rules, just a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, the household must have a lease or other rental agreement for up to 1 year, and the rent cannot exceed the maximum monthly rent the first year. So that cap that we talked about earlier, it can't go over that. The new rule also, though, is that if it's a rent stabilized apartment, the tenant can apply for an increase within the year, if not at the max rent. So if it's not the very top of it, if there's still some room left between what the rent amount actually is on the lease and what the cap is, and then the lease increases mid-year, the tenant can ask for an increase up to that rent cap. If there's a person younger than 18 in the home, the lease or other rental agreement must be for an apartment. And at the time of approval, HRA assumes the rent and subsidy will not change for 1 year. So whatever the rent is that's being submitted, they expect that that will not, that the subsidy is not going to change unless the tenant's income decreases, or if the apartment, like we just talked about a second ago, is rent regulated. Okay, next slide.
So the rent is set for 1 year unless rent regulated, as Zach said. So unlike FHEPS, CityFHEPS has a registration once a year, recertification. So if somebody gets, moves out of shelter, their registration every year, and they move out in January, is January every year. If somebody gets sued in the community and they settle their housing case and their CityFHEPS goes on the budget in July, their recertification every year will be July. Most rents are for 1 year, but some leases are 2 years. And there are, if sometimes HRA doesn't send the recertification form out, it is on the HRA's website. So I just printed one for a client who didn't get it, who's a senior, and mailed him a copy so he can fill it out and mail it back in. If a working family loses their income, so the rent is set for 1 year. So let's say we had a working family of 3, mom and 2 kids, and she loses her job, and she was making, let's say, $2,000 a month, but then she has to go receive cash assistance. She's only going to get a shelter allowance of $400 a month. She can request that her share, which was set for the year, be reduced. Now, if her income goes up, let's say she was on welfare when she started the program and they're paying $400 a month. If she starts working, then her share is not going to go up. She only has to pay the $400 if her cash assistance case closed. And so she gets the benefit of making more money that year. And so that's a nice little rule that they have for CityFHEPS. It also makes the program easier. They only have to fix things once a year. And generally, since the subsidy goes out through a different computer than the cash assistance case, the subsidy should be going out for the full year. And then if mom starts working, she can just pay that $400 for the rest of the year. So next slide.
So how is the amount of the subsidy set? So it works a little bit differently than FHEPS. And to walk through this, for someone who has, for a household that has no income and only cash assistance, you'd really use the chart that we spoke about earlier. So for a household of 3, again, we see here 2527, which is the 2127 CityFHEPS and the 400 for the shelter allowance. This is actually referring, we haven't updated this to the new May levels. This is for the September levels. So it's a little bit more for a household, or for a 3-bedroom. However, the point of this is that you start out with the shelter allowance for that household size, and then whatever remains of the rent is paid for through the CityFHEPS supplement. So 2 times a month, the shelter goes out, dividing the monthly shelter in half, and then the 1 monthly CityFHEPS check to supplement that goes out just a few days before the month in question. So it works a little bit differently when you have a household with mixed cash assistance and with actual employment income. So the shelter amount that goes out, let's say you have a household of 3, the shelter amount that goes out in that case, if you have 2 people who are on cash assistance and have no income, and then 1 person who does have income, you have the shelter allowance going out for, you have the shelter allowance going out for 2 people, the 2 people who are on the cash assistance, but not for the person who has income. And for that person who has income, they're expected to pay 30% of that income towards the rent. So in this example that you see below, if you have a rent amount of 2527 and it's a household of 3, and there are 2 people who are getting cash assistance and 1 with SSI, the shelter allowance for 2 is going out for the 2 people on cash assistance at 283. There's not the third person amount, so it's not 400 going out, it's only 283. And then the third person is expected to pay 259.20, which is 30% of the SSI of if it was 864. So in that case, the total amount that would go out would be $1,984.80, and the client would be expected to cover the remainder, the clients, the household. Okay, next slide.
So we're going to talk a little bit about subsidies and shares. So with FHEPS, the maximum subsidy is based on the cash assistance family size. If everybody's on cash assistance, then you count those the number of people, and that rent would be tied to the maximum number of people on cash assistance. However, for FHEPS, if you have a mixed income household, FHEPS does not subsidize working people or people on fixed income, does not subsidize their rent. So they can add money on top if we're going from a size 2 family to a 3, but they won't be able to afford, they can't rent a 2-bedroom at the full 2-bedroom level. They can only add 30% of their income on top of a 1-bedroom level. In FHEPS, the household has a minor in it, so they must be in an apartment or a house. They can't rent a room. And going forward, all the increases will generally be in January every year, unless the city has not been given what they think is their fair share for the Section 8 level, like happened this year. So CityFHEPS, the maximum subsidy is by all the countable people in the house. So that would be everybody who has immigration status. And if everybody has cash assistance, we would go by that amount. If there are people with SSI, their income will they will be subsidized so that they can have a bedroom. And so if you have 2 people on cash assistance and 1 person on SSI, they can go up to the 2nd bedroom in the apartment. So the general rule is 2 people per bedroom, except for 1 person household. So 1 person can have a studio or a 1-bedroom, and then 2 people can have 1 bedroom. But if we go up to the 3rd person, they would be eligible for a 2-bedroom. If there are no children in the home, a single person or a couple could rent a room or live in a single room occupancy. And both programs going forward will be tied to the NYCHA and Section 8 levels. So the CityFHEPS levels went up in May. We are expecting August 1st, I hope, that the FHEPS levels go up because they went up in February for FHEPS, but they haven't gotten the new increase that CityFHEPS got in May. Next.
So the 2 providers of CityFHEPS who you'll be working with are either home base or adult protective services. They can submit an application to HRA for a stay and pay case or a move case. Home base, particularly since the COVID shutdown, there is a shortage of staff and there's a high demand for services. A lot of staff are working remotely, so it has slowed down the process significantly. It is difficult to get an appointment. Unless extensive repairs are needed, you should refer your client to home base right after intake because of delays to scheduled screening appointments. And what we mean by unless extensive repairs are needed is The repairs are going to be needed for the apartment to pass inspection. So if you know if there are huge repairs that need to be fixed before you'd be able to submit a CityFHEPS application, you should address those repairs immediately. But there is a process with Homebase where they register clients through their own intake process, and then there's a CityFHEPS process afterwards. So it can take a while, and you should start as early as possible. Make sure you have all the identity documents and housing documents are gathered and delivered. Follow up to make sure appointments are happening. Get the landlord documents in housing court. So put those documents into your stipulations if you're an attorney to make sure that you're getting what you need to be able to move the application on as quickly as possible. Next slide.
So processing FHEPS and CityFHEPS applications. So FHEPS is processed by legal services providers like Legal Aid, or the homeless diversion units at the job centers, or adult protective services, very rarely. Usually we don't have adult protective services involved when there's a child in the house. FHEPS A and B moves. So FHEPS moves are processed by Homebase. Legal services providers can no longer do a move. Homebase will do an inspection, and the city will also run a database check to make sure there's no bad conditions in the apartment or violations. And with CityFHEPS, it's only done by Homebase or adult protective services in the community. In the shelters, the shelter providers do it. And then if somebody moves, needs to move instead of stay in their apartment, Homebase again or APS would take care of that. Next slide. So we're at 3 o'clock. 3:06.
Correct. I think, we want to get through these slides. If we're able to leave some time for questions at the end, that would be great. I know Isatu has been incredible in the chat, but I would say the most slides, that would be good.
We'll try to talk fast.
Okay, thank you.
So tenants, what do we do as advocates after intake for our tenants? We need to make sure that everyone in the household who is eligible has income, including a cash assistance. If there's no outside income and total household income, we need to make sure that all that together is under 200% of the FPL. Calculate rent for countable individuals, income, bedroom, utilities to make sure that we're below the cap. Make sure there are no child support or work sanctions on all adults that could interfere with the process. If the arrears are exceptionally high, we try to get them severed, waived, so that we can get it down to within the allowable amounts. We make sure that all the repairs are done so the apartments will pass inspection. And that includes a 5 database check for violations in apartment and common areas and virtual or actual inspection. We'll talk quickly about what that means in the following slides. Next.
So the landlord documents are a lease. There has to be a lease in either a lease agreement or a court stipulation that permits the tenant to stay for a year. There are different forms the landlord has to fill out, giving information about the landlord. With CityFHEPS, the city no longer, and for any tenants virtually, the city does not pay for security deposits anymore. They give a security voucher, which says if the tenant leaves in 3 months, leaves their apartment, and the landlord can apply within 3 months of the tenant moving out to get their security back if there is a need to do so. Homebase will want a landlord breakdown and a stipulation or a court order or rent demand. So currently in the year 2022, because of the pandemic, there is no requirement that the tenant actually be sued in court, but the tenant must have received a rent demand saying the landlord is about to sue. And with that and a landlord breakdown, tenants are eligible for CityFHEPS to stay or to move. The landlord must also provide a taxpayer ID, and their taxpayer ID must match the deed. Sometimes this can get a little complicated, and so the city at a high level can have the Department of Finance run a LexisNexis search to tie the landlord to, let's say, a real estate agent who's running the building for the landlord, because often they don't want to give their paperwork of their contracts. So and the city wants to make sure there's not something fraudulent going on, that the landlord's getting their money. And so there's also proof of ownership, such as a deed. So it's a little more complicated when there are co-ops, or the deed, the title to the property is different than who's managing the building. Next.
For these next couple of slides, we just wanted to list the other documents that the home-based provider, or APS, will have the tenant complete to before submitting the application. So there's a request for emergency assistance. They'll look for pay stubs for proof of income, a program participant agreement, tenant contact information. Next slide.
So the application process is when somebody goes to Homebase, they first do their own intake, which takes 45 minutes over the phone, and they ask for all sorts of identification to represent a individual or family. Then for the application process for CityFHEPS, once they have all the documents from the landlord and all the documents from the tenant, and they're all updated and current, then they start the application process. And so it's really important for you to help your clients gather those documents, because that's where we see the most delays, is gathering all the documents and that they are current documents. So then the Homebase then sends a copy of the deed and asks for a database check to be run by DHS or HRA. Then after that is the database check is okay, then a 12-page inspection is done by either the Homebase worker, which they did before the pandemic, or a virtual inspection is done by videotape by the tenant or a broker or a landlord. And after those two steps are done, the Homebase puts together an entire package, which they send to HRA for approval. So there's two waiting times, right? Waiting for that database check to be done, and again, waiting for HRA to review all the documents that Homebase has reviewed. And then they approve the apartment, or they say, hey, there's something missing. So we like it when it gets approved. We want this process to be done in 30 days, but it isn't necessarily done in 30 days. Then HRA at the Central Rent Processing Unit at East 16th Street, they process checks, and they're sent directly to the landlord, or APS or Homebase picks them up and delivers them to the landlord. So that's the application process. It's only 4 steps. We would like each of those steps to take only a week, but it's sometimes, we see sometimes this process can take 6 to 8 weeks, on top of gathering all the documents and having the intake done. So we have sometimes seen this process be 4 to 6 months. Next.
And again, the next 2 slides really just detail the databases that HRA checks, because for the most part, you have access to this information as well. So you're able to kind of get a head start on making sure that there aren't going to be any issues as you're putting these things forward. And if there are issues, you know what you need to address quickly to be able to have the apartment pass these clearance phases. So there's a Department of Buildings check for vacate orders, stop work orders, a DOB biz system for certain categories of complaints, certificate of occupancy, Department of Finance, if the deed matches the W-9, open lead paint orders must be corrected. They check with HPD for violations like heat, hot water litigation, comprehensive litigation. If there are issues, there's a contact that goes out to find out what those issues are. On the next database, the fire department database is checked on the next slide. And the New York State Department of Health is checked to make sure the building is not on the uncertified facilities list. So again, you can check these databases too for your clients. You don't waste time on an apartment that will never get approved, or you'll identify issues that are going to come up that you can resolve as this is going through the home-based process to kind of get a head start. Next slide.
So for a stay case, HRA will issue all the arrears as a one-shot with a recoupment or payback, depending on whether somebody's receiving cash assistance or is not receiving cash assistance. Tenants can challenge that payback through a fair hearing with the state or negotiate a payout agreement with HRA. There are no longer signing bonuses because the rent amounts they pay every month are high. For people who are staying in the community, they will pay the first month in full for tenants who are remaining in place and pay all or some of the arrears. If people are leaving shelter, they pay more money up front. And if the household receives cash assistance, the landlord will receive 2 shelter payments every month, and the subsidy, as we've said a few times, before the first of the month. Next.
So when can a move in the community happen instead of a stay and pay? Well, CityFHEPS moves in the community happen when there's an apartment and housing course case that does not pass a CityFHEPS application inspection. So we can't get it through, but they'll allow the tenant to move to a different apartment somewhere else because of repair issues or one of those other issues that we talked about in the databases. Not listed here, you have cases as well where you have certain types of holdovers, such as a no grounds holdover, where the landlord wants the apartment back and there's really no defense that your client has. You can get a CityFHEPS move submitted in those types of cases as well. They can also happen after an apartment is approved, but there's a health and safety need for a move after that approval and back rent has been paid. So even though the client's on CityFHEPS and they're in the apartment, they want to move due to a health and safety reason, you can then initiate a move application as well. This is a little bit different than the Section 8 programs where moves are actually easier to do. Here you have to show a health and safety concern. Next slide.
So if somebody needs to move, Homebase requests a shopping letter approval from HRA for the household if they already have CityFHEPS and they are qualified for a health and safety move. If they approve the shopping letter to Homebase or APS, and then a new CityFHEPS move application has to be submitted, processed. If somebody needs to move because they can't, the apartment, the landlord won't give them a lease, or the landlord says, I don't want you as my tenant anymore, or there are bad conditions in the apartment, HRA can also issue a shopping letter.
The shopping letters are typically good for between 90 and 120 days. Lately, mostly because of the COVID shutdown and how long processing is taking, they've been longer. Letter indicates the highest, the rent cap that CityFHEPS permits to the household. It also includes the estimated household share, refers to New York City Department of Social Services, source of income discrimination. I saw somewhere a question in the chat about who accepts CityFHEPS. Do you have a list of landlords that accept CityFHEPS vouchers? They all are required by law to. It is income discrimination to turn them away because they have a CityFHEPS voucher. Clients can go to the Human Rights Commission if that is violated. The letter also indicates that what documents are needed from the landlord to complete the process. Next slide.
So the tenant then has the shopping letter, and they call it a shopping letter to differentiate it from Section 8, which they call a voucher. So they have the shopping letter, which says to landlords, okay, Susan is eligible for her and her 2 kids for a 2-bedroom at this amount, and this will be her share. And so I have to go out and look for an apartment. And that's not easy these days because the rents are skyrocketing again. And then there are some corrupt landlords who know, oh, the new CityFHEPS and FHEPS levels are this, I'm going to charge $10 more for this unregulated apartment. And the landlords probably can get away with that. If it's a rent stabilized apartment and they're only allowed to raise it a little bit, then they may have be doing income discrimination because they've illegally raised the rent. So it's a complicated process to look for an apartment and find landlords who conform with the law. And there are some great landlords out there who will rent, who follow the law, and the city is working with landlords to try to sell their programs all the time. The zip codes where HPD pays extra for Section 8 are likely to pass rent reasonableness, but those zip codes can be very high. The rents tend to be higher than what CityFHEPS pays. Zip codes in outer neighborhoods such as Far Rockaway or East New York tend to have lower rents. But then sometimes the city will say, you have to lower the rent by $40, $50, $100 because it's a lower income zip code. So currently the rent reasonableness standard is on hold because there have been problems with it. The city has purchased more program to try to set what is reasonable in a neighborhood, and landlords, and they've now developed an appeal process for landlords, but not for tenants who want to say what the rent is reasonable. Tenant has to go back to home base, and then they have to go through all those steps, right? And if their case has been closed for many months, they may have to go back through intake again and get their case reopened again. So it can be a long process. Next.
So during COVID, there's a virtual walkthrough of the unit that can happen as the inspection process. So as Susan was mentioning, there's a 12-page apartment review checklist that home base or APS must complete, pictures of the common areas of the building and apartment. So the tenant can do this through their phone with photos or a walkthrough with video, or the landlord can, or a super. The part that's difficult is all repairs have to be made if the apartment has, even if there are small repairs. So electrical outlet covers, small cracks have to be fixed before the inspection can pass. So the good news is if there's small repairs, they should be able to be done easily, but it's not the kind of situation where a small repair you can fly past that. You can't. So a second inspection is done to make sure those small repairs are made, and this can cause delays. Next slide.
So home base submits a large packet with, before COVID, they'd send in 25 photos along with a 12-page application, and then information about the tenant and the landlord and all the documents everybody has to sign. So it's a very long submission. And then HRA has to review all those documents, and it takes them sometimes longer than a week, and that can delay things. And then checks are issued for CityFHEPS by the Landlord Ombudsman Services Unit, which is also at East 16th Street, and they generally send the back rent directly to the landlord. There's a new system that's going online in September called Current, And HRA will be asking landlords to join that system where they can get electronic payments and have a page of all the tenants that are having their rents paid by the city, so that they have a quick way to check up whether Mrs. Cruz and Mrs. Smith have had their rent paid for the month of July. Next.
So FHEPS and CityFHEPS work slightly differently for the move. Both offer the first month of rent fully paid, and then the supplement is issued for the next 3 months. FHEPS, it's half a month of the broker's fee. For CityFHEPS, though, it's 15% of the year's rent for the broker. Both issue the security voucher. For FHEPS, there's no hold on the apartment, but for CityFHEPS, the unit hold can be paid for 1 month if there's an HRA delay in the processing. So you can get a lease that starts a month early, you can still get the landlord paid for that extra month, whereas you can't for FHEPS. There's currently no signing bonus for either FHEPS or CityFHEPS. This is a rule change. Up until last year, the amount had gone up to about $4,300 of a signing bonus that CityFHEPS offered, but that is no longer the case. So please be aware that this is no longer a selling point we love to tout for CityFHEPS with this signing bonus, and it's no longer something that we can say will be offered. All right, next slide.
Brokers better get another livelihood.
Moves from the shelter and in the community. So FHEPS A moves from shelter are processed by shelter providers. HRA and processes them for people in the DV shelters, and they are heavily involved with those move outs. And FHEPS A and B are processed in the community, but Homebase does all the inspections and does those processing. CityFHEPS moves from shelter, processed by shelter providers, and CityFHEPS A and B will be processed probably by Homebase. Right now, the CityFHEPS B program hasn't started. It's just been approved as of December. Next.
More differences between FHEPS and CityFHEPS in terms of modifications, research, restorations, and renewals. So for FHEPS, there's no annual recertification. The cash assistance must remain open, and the youngest child must be a minor. In CityFHEPS, there's an annual recertification where you report income, and any changes that affect your subsidy then happen based off of that. In FHEPS, the household must modify if there's an income change or a household change within 3 months of a change. It's on them to actually submit that to HRA. For CityFHEPS, the subsidy is set for 1 year, and you can modify it if there's you can then apply for modification if there's saved life or lost income. For FHEPS, you can restore the subsidy within 1 year without a lawsuit. In other words, if it falls off for some reason, or you lose the cash assistance case, but then you're able to open a new cash assistance case, you're able to restore it within 1 year. The subsidy in CityFHEPS can be restored for good cause for longer than 1 year. So even if you've lost it over a year ago, you're still able to work directly to get it restored without having another lawsuit to reinitiate an application. And then there's a 5-year time limit. FHEPS, theoretically, there's a 5-year time limit with good cause extension. We haven't seen FHEPS turned off for anyone for the 5-year amount. It is turned off for minors, no more minors being in the household, but the 5-year time limit, we haven't seen that take effect, but it is a possibility that it could per the regulations. For CityFHEPS, there's a 5-year time limit with some groups and good cause for others. But with the new law, there's no time limit. So that's CityFHEPS is now ongoing without a time limit. Next slide.
So one can have a hearing for CityFHEPS through the city. Because it's CityFHEPS, you don't do a state fair hearing at Bourne Place, or you don't call state OTDA. You get your fair hearing rights through, because it's a city benefit, through HRA, and they hold their hearings at East 16th Street. They try to conference the cases and settle them and figure out what the problem is. I've done a few, and mainly that's what I've done with clients who've needed help with their CityFHEPS. Fair hearings take a long time, so we try to resolve these issues quicker with avoiding fair hearings. So check problems are generally fixed by the central rent processing unit, not at the center because it's a special subsidy. Legal providers can contact HRA if their recertification is late or a check was missed or something needs to be fixed. And the legal aid team is very proficient in CityFHEPS, even though we didn't create this program. It's very similar to the FHEPS program, and through litigation, the FHEPS program was created. So we know the rules, and we're happy to answer questions. So just email us, and we're happy to answer a question by email or set up time to talk. Is that the last slide? Oh, I think this is a good place to leave because I don't think we really need to go over the counting bedrooms and the electric, because we went over that earlier, but it's good to have these materials.
Okay, great. And those will go out, these slides will be sent to everyone. I want to thank you both for leading this training, and to ISIT for handling the chat. I know we're at time, but if we could go over a few questions. Susan, I know you have to leave. Zach, do you have a few minutes?
I have 10 minutes. I'm okay.
I can go over. Thank you for all of the questions. There were some questions that were definitely more prevalent than others. So I kind of have a list. Some people were worried about the 5-year limit for CityFHEPS. I mentioned that we haven't really seen anyone get kicked off of CityFHEPS after 5 years. But if you do see that happening to one of your clients, please contact a legal service provider, because we need to know if HRA starts to do these things so that we can take the appropriate actions to make sure that they stop.
New rules, that should not be happening.
Right.
With the new rule.
Yes. So for undocumented individuals, whether they're in shelter or coming from the community, are there any opportunities for undocumented individuals with families to be eligible for CityFHEPS?
So both Legal Aid and a coalition of advocates are advocating with the city to make CityFHEPS eligible for people without immigration status. Currently, any individual in the home who has no immigration status cannot get CityFHEPS. But let's say mom has no immigration status and her citizen children have status, they're usually eligible for FHEPS. If we had a brother and sister, one is a citizen and one has no immigration status, sister could get CityFHEPS for one, and brother could squeeze in with her. So if there's a mixed status household, the people with status could get either FHEPS or CityFHEPS. The problem is when everybody has no status, there currently is no rent subsidy for them. But we hope that there'll be advocacy in the future to create something for such individuals and families.
And one quick question was, does that minor need to be does the child need to be over the age of 18?
So it depends which program, right? So if it's the FHEPS program, the minor has to be under 18 or under 19, and the child would have to be receiving cash assistance. for CityFHEPS, the rule is, it's complicated because you must have an adult who is receiving disability benefits over 60 or working over 30 hours. So if you have that adult, that would work.
And there was another quick question, do Green Heart card holders qualify? Zach answered yes, and it's basically anyone with some sort of status in the United States could qualify. So that includes even temporary permanent status. They need to just have status within the United States. So that's the big difference. There was also a question about the lawsuit requirement being waived through the end of the year. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So for FHEPS, they will pay $20,000 in arrears because of the lawsuit requirement, and we believe they pay the same amount for CityFHEPS. Although the CityFHEPS money in arrears would be recoupable, and that amount, the waiver of the lawsuit requirement still means there must be a rent demand and a rent breakdown from the landlord in order to get FHEPS or CityFHEPS through December 31st of 2022. We will be advocating to extend that waiver beyond December 31st, 22, because there's such a huge backlog in the housing court that we're going to need that waived. And we'll also be asking that higher arrears be issued because we're starting to see cases where people owe 30,000 or 40,000. And there's not enough charity money to add on to the 20,000 that the city or state will pay.
Another question, and there were so many varieties of this question, y'all, so I'm just combining it into one, and it's more of a strategy question. The CityFHEPS home base backlog and calling home bases and trying to schedule appointments and trying to get in contact with someone. There were even a couple of people who've gone through either all or the majority of the process with the home-based caseworker, only to find out that that caseworker no longer is working at the home base. So what should people in those situations do where it's been kind of either no contact with home base or very difficult to keep in contact with home base?
I think we will give to Tess a list for advocates only, not to give to clients, a list of HRA contacts. There's a person named Dana Guyette at HRA, and if there's a problem not being able to get through to home base, this is what I recommend, and this is what I do with my clients. Have your client call the home base or email them 3 times in 1 week. And write down what days they call and what time they call and what number they call. And if they get no contact, then they go back to you, the advocate, and then you email Dana Guyette. Please do not give out her email to your clients or I will have my head taken off. Don't do that because I have 2 children to pay off their college debts. So contact Dana Guyette and say, hey, my client emailed or called at these days and this time and couldn't get through to X or Y or Z home base. And that way we want to put pressure on Dana to make sure that more people can get through to home base, because we know and we all know that it's a big problem.
I see Melissa just wrote on here as well, Melissa Lopez, and I would say this is a great strategy. And this is something that I would do before the pandemic as well is to go into home base myself. I know it's a little more difficult now with COVID and concerns for health and safety, both for your clients and for yourselves. But walking into home base often did the job for me because you can speak to someone there. So depending on your comfort level, there's that. I also would recommend that if you're speaking with someone who's a caseworker, that you also, if you're at any point in time, you should try to get a little bit of the hierarchy, right? So there's usually a caseworker, a supervisor, and assistant director. So if a caseworker goes missing and they've been replaced by someone else, it might be that the supervisor or the assistant director knows. So trying to find out that information at the beginning of the process is helpful. I mean, the Dana Guyette is the nuclear option at the end if you're not able to resolve it in some other way.
So we have a question. Does an application without a social security number qualify to apply? No.
You have to apply if somebody's missing a social security number or eligible for a social security number, even an infant, because the infant could be applying. And mom might not have one. So the infant's going to need the social security number. So if there's a newborn in the house, you should be applying for the social security number and then applying for home base. So if it's like mom and a newborn.
So for the question about that the clients are told that they need an appointment, they can request. So this is where sometimes we have to tell our clients, advocate for yourself. They can say, okay, I need an appointment. Can I request an appointment? And if they say, well, you have to call this phone number for an appointment, tell them to take that phone number, stand outside, call that phone number and request an appointment. If that doesn't work, they go back inside and say, I called and I requested an appointment, but no one picked up. What should I do now? So, you have to, it's a teamwork thing with the clients. And a lot of clients know this. They got their paperwork ready. They're ready to do what they need to do. So that's you just telling them what their role is in trying to get an appointment.
So a lot of the home bases are not open fully. So they may be open only 1 day or 2 days a week to take papers. So they're not really seeing clients. They're interviewing over the phone, which makes it much more difficult to knock on the door. So it's a big problem.
For home base, it's equally as frustrating for them. They're facing staff shortages and there's a deluge of applications coming in for them because of what's going on right now. So they're underwater and struggling with this, and some patience with them too, and understanding their process is important.
Absolutely. What can a client do if they receive a termination notice from CityFHEPS after they have already sent in their renewal packet? They've tried to call regarding the situation several times.
So if they aren't getting through, and that number is off, the RAP number, RAP number, is rarely answered. It's very hard to get through. Afternoons are better than mornings, but try to get through to the RAP number to see if if the recertification went through. And Dana Guyette can also be emailed by an advocate saying, hey, Susan Bond didn't get her recertification papers done. Here's a copy of them. They should be processed in 30 days. So if they haven't been processed in 30 days, they could have been lost in the mail, they could, or something. So after 30 days is when you start to worry. But they should be processed in 30 days. We saw delays with the new levels going out. It was taking them 6 to 8 weeks, but generally processed in 30 days. But again, go to Dana Guyette if there are problems at the rental assistance unit. And I put her email in the chat.
Is there any more immediate solution for a client who does not have their Social Security card? Is there anything else that they can use?
They should get a copy, call Social Security 1-800 number, and they can get a new card in the mail. If they have a copy of their card, that's a good thing to bring. If they have a copy of their card at the welfare center, welfare could print out a copy. All right, I gotta go. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, everybody. And we'll have another training with answers on FHEPS and CityFHEPS, and the whole team, you know, depending on which borough you're in, email our FHEPS team, borough by borough, and we're available 5 days a week for questions.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sharing in the chat again some of our upcoming events. We have a NYCHA reasonable accommodations training coming up in a couple of weeks, and we'll get that link out to you. We have a presentation on some research done on the relationship between family shelters and health. And there will be some resources related to that. And then we have a FHEPS training in early August, and I'm sure I will see many of you there. I don't want to keep our trainers any longer unless I see there's a question that you think we should get to right now.
No, but the material will have our contact information. There was one more question, but I'm trying to find it. Sorry.
I know the chat's moving very quickly.
The material will have our contact information. I'll be back for the FHEPS training, and also Susan will be back for the Ask a Lawyer. So there will be multiple opportunities to ask questions. The question that I saw was, what can a client do if they do not have a renewal lease? If they live in a rent stabilized unit, they do not need a renewal lease because they have the right to, it's an automatic right to renewal based on the law for rent stabilized, rent controlled, anyone who has rent regulated, who lives in a rent regulated unit. If it's unregulated, that becomes a little bit more complicated. That's where you'll have to do a little bit of advocacy with the landlord, reaching out to the landlord and seeing if you can get a copy of that. Zach, what have you done? Yeah.
We do see a lot of cases where you're in a negotiation in court with a landlord based off of arrears, and they're only willing to reduce or sever the arrears or give a new lease if the arrears are paid. And so a conditional stipulation or a conditional agreement will also suffice in these cases with HRA. So some sort of a documentation, whether it's a court document or otherwise, saying we will give a lease for 1 year if the arrears are paid, will work at the HRA level.
Linus?
Yes, how you doing, everyone? I'm gonna ask a question and concerns to a person who has a CityFHEPS voucher that's been living at independent living for over 5 years and wants to upgrade to a 1-bedroom apartment because it's been in the studio. Is that possible with
So yes, it is possible for them to get a transfer voucher, but they have to have reasoning behind wanting to get that transfer voucher. They would have to still go to their home base to get that transfer voucher. But if it's in the same building, I believe it should be easier. But yeah, the home base is the first point of contact for that.
another thing is that that person also had rent arrears.
Mm-hmm.
And completed the ERAP application, everything got approved, not approved, but basically is in the process of the landlord responding.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's been really difficult for her to move on into
right. So you will have to deal with the issues of the rent arrear before you can get the transfer voucher.
What would be a reason for an upgrade, like physical health or space?
Right, that can definitely physical health. It can be the size of the family, the needs of the individual, right? Like if they need medical equipment to be in the apartment, in the studio, or single room occupancy is just too small, stuff like that. Okay. In those cases, normally the home-based caseworker will work with the person to figure out why they are trying to get a bigger apartment, and it's not really that much bigger. So
we've also seen cases where we have individuals who are in a situation where they feel that they're enduring harassment from the landlord and or from neighbors, and they're very uncomfortable being in the apartment for those reasons. That's also a health and safety concern. So don't think of it as just, I have this disease and I need this extra space for this. It's much broader. And this is one of those things where there's not an exact formula. It really is about advocacy. Framing it.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you all so much. We will follow up again with the recording, the training, and the resources mentioned throughout this. And we'll get everyone that date for the Ask a Lawyer session. So if you didn't get your questions answered, of course, you can email our amazing trainers, but we'll have that session for you as well. So thank you, Zach. Thank you, ICT.